way to the top. We got so far to go, even farther back to home. So many times we could have stopped when we got stuck in the mud and we felt like giving up. But this is our road, and y'all are my people. No matter where we go, never alone. No, we're not gonna stop till we get to the peak. Going high, 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 gonna fly through the ether.
Hello, and welcome to Notes from the Healing Field, a safe space for self-healers to explore their own journey. I am Krista Xiomara, your host and guide. The intention of this podcast is to create an open source spiritual classroom for every sentient being who's navigating the human experience. Together, we will examine themes of awakening, healing, and integration. We will use our curiosity as our guide on this path of expansion and compassion as our compass. All the information shared is open source and free to everyone and is intended to support the collective awakening and liberation of humanity in harmony with our highest shared desire for peace on earth. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's get into it. Hi, and welcome back to the Healing Field. This is a space for self-healers to explore their own journey. I am Krista Xiomara, your guide and host of the popular podcast, I'm Awake, Now What? Today is episode 1, and we are going to be exploring the self-healing journey, what happens on that journey, and how we stay the course. So where I want to start in today's episode is first calling out some really specific language here. So if you are listening to this video, there's a good chance you've heard both of these words. And if you haven't, we're going to go ahead and define them and talk about them a little bit. So number 1 is self-healer. That's what you're doing here. This is what I'm doing here. This is what I've been doing for the last decade or so of my life. Then there's also the term I want to talk about called alchemist. Okay, so that's also a really fancy way to say we're a self-healer. So when we talk about the self-healing journey, it's when we take ownership of what has occurred to us in our life and have decided that instead of being victimized by what has occurred, we want to understand what those situations, people, circumstances, pain, trauma, suffering, what it's taught us, how it's changed us, how it's made us a different person, and then what can we do with that? This is a very creative process that people don't normally talk about it in those terms when we think about healing. Now, in terms of being an alchemist, I think this is such a beautiful, beautiful term for all of us to take on as our armor in this world. And soft armor here is what I want to say here. When we think about alchemy, we think about people turning base metals into something beautiful like gold. And in the process of healing and the self-healing, we are taking the base elements of the things that make us human beings and then the base elements of the things that have occurred to us. And we're looking at the pain and we're turning it into purpose. We're looking at our wounds and we're turning them into wisdom. So we are beautiful chemists on this journey of self-healing. And we're also thinking about, we've been injured potentially from external forces. We don't want to injure externally. So that's part of the process as well. And we will talk about that in more detail. So why would anybody want to go on this journey? Probably asking yourself if you haven't really thought about this at all. I think it's important for us to acknowledge that in our current culture and our current society, it doesn't matter what gender, race, religion, ideology, agnostic, all the things, atheists. As a species, humans, we have a propensity to want to ignore the things that happen to us. We have this idea that the things that cause us pain, to look at them in any long degree or sense of staying with it for too long can hurt more than actually just sweeping it under the rug. So I want to remind everybody without judgment here that we are all conditioned to do this, to sweep things under the rug, to not deal with them, to watch the patterns play over and over until they hurt so much that we have to do something about them. So that's where we all find ourselves usually at the precipice of this journey, is that it hurts so much and we want a different outcome. So we go on the self-healing journey. So some of the things of why we would even go here is we want to change. We keep getting stuck in the same situations with the same outcomes and asking, like, how did this happen again? How did I end up with that same toxic relationship? How did I find myself in another abusive friendship? How did I find myself in another quarrel with my family? How is it that I have put myself into another financial situation? Put a blank in there for whatever that is for you, okay? But we're all asking the question, like, why is this happening? How can I change it? The other thing is breaking these patterns that have been conditioned to us, whether that's generational, cultural, gender, religious. There are patterns that we recognize in our ecosystems, our individual ecosystems, that aren't working for us, but that we're going along with, and we don't necessarily want to. So some of that questioning comes from the idea of, like, could I do this differently? Could this be different for me? And then the biggest one, I think, for me and from everyone I've talked to that's come to my podcast and all of the research I've done on self-healing, is ultimately what it's really about is we feel fragmented about ourselves. The world has asked us to show up in really specific ways at work, in our relationships with our friends, and even within our friend groups, depending on which friends you have. Like, sometimes we don't even want to intermingle our different friend groups, right? Because we're different people for those different friend groups. Well, that becomes so untenuous and so heavy and so energetically exhausting that we come on this journey to then put ourselves back into an integrated state where we're aligned and at peace with ourselves, and we are the same person inside every one of those situations, because that is very, very cumbersome. So those are some reasons why we would even go on this healing journey in the first place. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how do we go about this journey, which I think is a really good question to start asking yourself if you want to create some internal healing. The first step for me, in my mind's eye, is always listening to ourselves and listening to what wants to be healed. Like, there might be something very specific that keeps coming up for you. Maybe it's the way you attach in relationships. Perhaps it's the way you don't feel like you can fully be yourself in a work situation. Maybe it's that you want to show more parts of your personality, but your ecosystem has told you that it's not safe to do that. Okay, so you have to think about what it is that you really want to be healed. It could also be really deep and dark. Past trauma that has happened, childhood trauma, childhood abuse, alcoholic parents. I mean, I like to say, without any harshness, but just with the reality, to just dispel this idea that it's somewhat like taboo to even talk about healing or the things that happen to us. But I think if we're human beings and we're interacting with one another, especially if we're unconscious, it's very possible we're coming into contact with some pain or some trauma in our lives, and that's okay. So we're here to undo all of that, to create some peace and some love and some compassion and some integration with us. So I want us to not be worried about thinking about how it happened, more about how do we start undoing what happened. And the other next best step, I think, in my mind's eye, is just listening to your gut, or sometimes we call it your intuition, your internal guidance systems, about what needs to heal in what order. And then using that same intuition and that internal guidance system to start picking up tools. And so I'm going to name off a few tools here that I've learned on my journey, but also want to disclaim here, there's a whole gamut of things that we can use and at our disposal without having to pay. So I want to be really clear about, there's also the idea that a lot of our internal healing can happen in the privacy of our own home, in the privacy of our own heart, in the safest space that we feel possible. So when we think about different types of therapy, we've got dance therapy, water therapy, nature therapy, sound therapy, and even talk therapy. These are all things that we can do on our own. Then we've got retreats and journaling. We can go to silent retreats. We can go to group retreats. We can go to travel retreats. We can take a day retreat somewhere to go hiking, to just be in nature and just sit still. Then we've got journaling. We've got support systems. I mean, I'm not going to name everything off here. I just want to show you that there is basically a spectrum of things and tools that we can start grabbing. There's also educational resources, podcasts, videos. You're listening to me right here, right now. But the point of all of this that I want to call specific attention to is the fact that when we have pain and trauma and suffering that requires healing, that because we don't talk about it often, it gets stuck somewhere. So we know already through scientific study, through psychological studies, that our pain and trauma can lodge in our body, it can stay in our mind, it can play as an old pattern, a mental pattern. So when we're creating therapeutic tools to aid us in our self-healing, we want to create a physical release of the pain as well. And that's so important. It's so important to move your body, move your thoughts, speak into the ether what hurts. So I'm not sure who said this, but I think it's so important. This quote that healing is the application of compassion to the places inside of us that hurt and require repair. So that's what we're doing as self-healers. And we're trying to figure out what is the exact formula that we require. And we're intuitively listening to what that equation is for us to cultivate healing. And it won't always be the same for each thing. So I wanted to call specific attention to that. And we will talk about all of those things in more depth in other episodes. But we're doing a high level overview of what we're doing here as self-healers. Okay, so the last thing I want to say about going on the self-healing journey, which I have a lot to say, and this is why we're doing this series, but just for today's episode, I think it's important to address that when we go on the self-healing journey, it's not a one and done thing. Especially because I mentioned back there, like we are interacting with one another all the time. We injure each other consciously and unconsciously. The goal is to not injure each other consciously. We would love the world to get to that place, right? Where we're all consciously making decisions about not hurting one another, okay? But we're a little far off from that, but we're not going to get distracted by that. Okay, so what I want to say is when we go on the healing journey, it's a lifelong commitment. It's for the rest of our lives. Not only because we're coming into contact with things that could injure us, and that could be big T trauma and small T trauma. It can be the spectrum. But it's also because even when we go and start healing things and it feels like they've come to completion, it only takes a certain situation, a person, a circumstance for us to get triggered and realize there is still more healing here that needs to happen. And why would I call your attention to this? I want to call your attention to this because I want to remind you to give yourself immense amount of grace and space and patience to allow your own self-healing to unfold in its own time and as many times as it needs to, and to just not get frustrated with yourself on the healing journey. I think that's incredibly important and very, very special to think about that, and to just continue to hold yourself in that loving, compassionate space where you're giving yourself the permission and giving yourself the honor of allowing yourself to heal in your own time and as many times as you need to. Okay, so that's your work as we go into this journey together, and I'm here for you. The other thing I want to talk about is like the tangible things, right? We need support systems. We need tools and aids that help us stay the course. For me, that's been my therapist, my friends, my meditation practices, my practice with nature, my practice of coming back into myself. Self-forgiveness is a huge one as well too. I went along this journey with the intention of wanting to live consciously that I didn't injure myself, so I didn't injure others. So one of the big things for me was I noticed one of my patterns was self-sabotage. I think we all go through this in some capacity. And in self-sabotaging, I would outwardly injure somebody, but then the outcome would be that I would then injure myself. And I didn't want to have that relationship with myself anymore. And that's just one small facet of my healing journey as an example. And so I thought, I don't want to go out and injure the world. I want to live in a conscious way where I don't hurt anybody consciously anymore. That was my big thing. And I found myself on the Buddhist path that really helped me do that. And so when we think about the healing journey and all of the tangible things that we need to support us on this, we have to find a support system that is loving and compassionate. And also, I just want to say too, when you have friends and pastors or rabbis or spiritual advisors, whomever you have as your insulated bubble, it's important that they don't necessarily need to understand the process that you're going through or understand why you're going on this journey. They just have to hold the space for you to be on this journey. So I think it's important to say that. I want to underline that piece. All right, guys, this is the end of episode 1. We're going to keep them short. We're going to keep them sweet, but we're going to try to hit all the high notes and help you along your self-healing journey. Because I am a big believer that if we work on the individual, the collective will continue to shift. So I'm here to help the collective shift on the individual level. And I look forward to getting to work with you guys and to hear about your own healing journey. And I really appreciate you guys coming to this episode, and I wish you the best.
This podcast was written, directed, and produced by me, your host, Krista Xiomara, in alignment with Light Casting. Original song, Sword, composed and produced by Sing Hits, with lead vocals by X. Rack up some good karma by sharing this podcast with another self-healer. You can find notes from the healing field on all social media channels and YouTube. Head over to your favorite podcast app and subscribe, rate, and review.
All the small wins give us hope. Little signs to let us know that we're not so far away. We're gonna make it to the goal. Cups dry, but our hearts are full. So let everybody